The rain poured in relentless sheets, each drop a cold, stinging slap against her skin as she stumbled through the darkened forest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her bare feet sinking into the muddy earth, the hem of her dress torn and frayed, catching on jagged branches. She didn't know how long she'd been running, hours, maybe, or only minutes that stretched into eternity. Her heart pounded, a wild drumbeat drowning out the storm's roar, urging her forward despite the pain searing her legs. The town she'd fled was a blur of betrayal, the man she'd trusted, his lies exposed in a single, cruel moment, and the suffocating walls of a life she could no longer endure. She'd bolted from the saloon's back door, her dress ripping as she pushed through the crowd, their laughter chasing her into the night. Now, the forest was her only refuge, its shadows both a shield and a threat. Lightning cracked above, illuminating gnarled trees that seemed to reach for her with skeletal fingers. Her arms were scratched, her hair plastered to her face, and the thin fabric of her dress clung to her trembling body, offering no warmth. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stop. Somewhere behind her, she imagined footsteps, real or not, they haunted her, pushing her deeper into the wilderness. Her knees buckled, and she fell against a tree, gasping, her hands scraping bark as she fought to stand. The cold was merciless, seeping into her bones. But surrender wasn't an option. She'd made a vow to herself under the dim glow of a lantern in that wretched town. No more cages, no more lies. She'd rather die in this storm than return. A twig snapped nearby, and her head whipped around, eyes wide with terror. Was it him? Had he followed her? The wind howled, carrying her fear into the void. She pushed off the tree, staggering forward, her torn dress catching again, ripping further. The rain blurred her vision, but she sensed the forest thinning, the trees giving way to open land. Ahead, a faint glow flickered, a lantern, perhaps, or a trick of her exhausted mind. She didn't care. It was something to run toward, something that wasn't the past. Her feet slipped in the mud, but she clawed her way forward, driven by a spark of hope she couldn't name. The glow grew brighter, steadier, and with it came the silhouette of a figure, a man, tall and broad, standing against the storm. Her heart lurched. Friend or foe, she couldn't tell, but she was too tired to turn back now. Character count, 2,998. 2. The man stood motionless, his hat tilted low against the rain, his long coat flapping in the wind like the wings of some dark bird. She froze, her breath catching as she weighed her options: to run, hide, or face him. Her body screamed for rest, but fear kept her rooted, her eyes locked on the stranger. He stepped forward, and the lantern in his hand cast a warm, wavering light across the muddy clearing. She flinched, her hands clutching the remnants of her dress, suddenly aware of how exposed she was, her arms bare, her skirt in tatters, her skin streaked with dirt and blood. The man's boots sank into the earth as he approached, slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. But there was no malice in his posture, no threat in the way he held the lantern high, as if to show her he meant no harm. "You're hurt," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the rain's roar like a blade through silk. She didn't respond, her throat too tight to form words. He was a cowboy, she realized it. His hat, his boots, the worn leather of his coat marked him as a man of the open plains, not the polished deceit of the town she'd fled. His face was shadowed, but his eyes caught the lantern's glow, sharp and searching, yet softened by something she couldn't place. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, stopping a few paces away, giving her space. She wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury she'd lost long ago. The rain battered her, and a shiver racked her body, her teeth chattering. He noticed, his jaw tightening, and without a word, he shrugged off his coat, the heavy fabric sliding from his shoulders. He held it out, an offering, not a demand. "Take it," he said, his tone firm but kind. She hesitated, her pride warring with her need. The cold was winning, though, and her fingers trembled as she reached for the coat. It was warm from his body, smelling of leather and wood smoke, and as she draped it over her shoulders, it felt like a shield against the storm and maybe against the world. "What's your name?" he asked, but she shook her head, not ready to give even that much. He didn't press, just nodded, as if he understood. "Come with me," he said, turning toward the glow she'd seen earlier. A small cabin, its windows spilling light into the night. She glanced back at the forest, then at him, weighing the risk. But the warmth of his coat and the steadiness in his voice tipped the scale. She followed, her steps unsteady but determined, the rain still falling but no longer her enemy. The cabin loomed closer, promising shelter, and for the first time in hours, she felt the faintest stir of safety. Character count, 2,995-3. The cabin was small but sturdy, its wooden walls weathered by years of storms like this one. She hesitated at the threshold, the cowboy holding the door open, the warmth from inside beckoning her like a siren's call. Her bare feet were caked with mud, and she felt a pang of shame at the thought of tracking dirt across his floor. But he gestured her in, his expression unreadable but not unkind. She stepped inside, the coat heavy on her shoulders, and the door closed behind her, muffling the storm's fury. The room was simply a stone fireplace crackled with a low fire, casting flickering shadows across a worn table, a single chair, and a narrow bed in the corner. The air smelled of pine and smoke, and the warmth was immediate, wrapping around her like a blanket. She stood dripping on the floor, clutching the coat tighter, unsure of what to do next. The cowboy set the lantern on the table and moved to the fire, adding a log with practiced ease. "Sit," he said, pointing to the chair, and she obeyed, her legs too weak to argue. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just busied himself at a small stove, pouring water into a kettle. She watched him, her eyes darting to every corner of the room, searching for danger out of habit. But there was none here, just the quiet rhythm of his movements, the crackle of the fire, and the rain's steady drum against the roof. He handed her a tin mug of steaming tea, and she took it with trembling hands, the warmth seeping into her palms. "You're safe here," he said, and she wanted to believe him, but her heart was still racing, her mind replaying the night's horrors. She sipped the tea, its bitterness grounding her, and studied him as he leaned against the wall, his hat now off, revealing dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. He was older than she'd first thought, his face lined with the kind of weariness that came from a life of hard choices. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse. He shrugged, his eyes meeting hers. "Seen enough folks hurt in my time. Don't need to add to it." His words were simple, but they carried weight, and she felt a knot loosen in her chest. She didn't tell him her story, not yet, but the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that held space for truths too raw to speak. The fire popped, and she sipped her tea, the coat still draped over her, its weight a reminder of his kindness. Outside, the storm raged on, but in here, time seemed to pause, giving her a moment to breathe, to feel human again. Character count, 2,992-4. As the fire's warmth seeped into her bones, she felt the weight of her exhaustion settle like a stone in her chest. Her eyes darted to the cowboy, who was now cleaning a rifle with methodical care, his hands steady and sure. He didn't look at her, giving her space to exist without scrutiny, and she was grateful for it. The mug of tea was still warm in her hands, but her mind was far from the cabin, spiraling back to the town, to the man who'd promised her everything and delivered nothing but pain. She'd been naive once, believing in love, in promises whispered under starlight. But those promises had turned to ash, and she'd paid the price for her trust. Her fingers tightened around the mug, and she realized she was shaking, and not from cold, but from the memories clawing at her. The cowboy glanced up, his eyes catching hers for a moment before returning to his work. "You don't have to tell me nothing," he said, his voice low, "but if you're running from someone, I need to know if they're coming." She swallowed, her throat dry despite the tea. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think a broken bar. I think he might." The cowboy nodded, as if he'd expected as much, and set the rifle down. "Then we'll be ready," he said, and the certainty in his tone made her believe him, if only for a moment. He stood and pulled a blanket from the bed, draping it over her lap. The gesture was small but deliberate, and it stirred something in her, a flicker of trust she hadn't felt in years. She wanted to ask him who he was, why he lived alone in this cabin, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she watched the fire, its flames dancing like her thoughts, wild and untamed. The rain was softer now, a gentle patter against the roof, But the storm wasn't over, and neither was her fear. She thought of the man she'd fled, his cruel smile, the way his hands had gripped her wrist, promising pain if she ever left. She'd left anyway, and now she was here, in a stranger's cabin. Wrapped in his coat and his kindness, the cowboy sat across from her, his presence steady, like an anchor in the chaos of her mind. "You got a name?" he asked again, softer this time. She hesitated, then whispered, "Clara." It was the first piece of herself she'd given him, and it felt like a leap. He nodded, as if it was enough. "I'm Eli," he said, and the simplicity of the exchange grounded her. The fire crackled, and for a moment, the world outside didn't exist, just this cabin, this warmth, and the man who'd given her a chance to breathe. Character count, 2,997-5. The night stretched on, the fire's glow casting long shadows across the cabin's walls. Clara sat trapped in Eli's coat and blanket, her body warming but her mind still restless. The tea was gone, the empty mug resting on her lap, and she traced its rim with her finger, anchoring herself to the present. Eli had returned to his rifle, polishing it with a rag, but his movements were slower now, his eyes occasionally flicking to the window. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the air felt heavy, as if the storm was gathering strength for another assault. Clara's thoughts churned, piecing together the fragments of her escape. She'd been so careful, waiting for the right moment to slip away, but she hadn't planned for the rain, the cold, or the way her body would betray her with exhaustion. She hadn't planned for Eli, a man who seemed to belong to the land itself, solid and unyielding, yet gentle in a way she hadn't expected. She wanted to ask him why he was alone, why he lived in this isolated cabin, but the question felt too personal, too raw. Instead, she said, "You don't seem surprised to find someone like me out here." Eli paused, his hand stilling on the rifle. "Folks run for all kinds of reasons," he said, his voice measured. "Seen it before. Doesn't always end well." There was a weight to his words, a story he wasn't telling, and Clara felt a pang of recognition. She wasn't the only one carrying scars. "You ever run?" she asked, surprising herself. He looked at her, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "Once," he said, and left it at that. The silence that followed was thick but not uncomfortable, like two people sharing a secret without speaking it. Clara's gaze drifted to the window, where the world outside was a blur of gray and shadow. She wondered if her pursuer was out there, his anger driving him through the storm. The thought made her stomach twist, and she pulled the coat tighter around her. Eli noticed, his brow furrowing. "If he comes, he won't get past me," he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice was a lifeline. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with gratitude and fear. The fire popped, sending a spark drifting upward, and Clara watched it fade, her thoughts drifting to the life she'd left behind, a life of false promises and hidden bruises. She didn't know what came next, but for now, this cabin was her sanctuary, and Eli was her shield. The night felt endless, but in its quiet moments, she began to believe she might survive it. Dawn was still hours away, but cabin felt like a world apart from the chaos Clara had fled. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly, and Eli had moved out the window, peering into the darkness as if he could sense something she couldn't. Clara's eyes were heavy, her body aching for rest, but sleep felt like a betrayal, too vulnerable, too close to letting her guard down. She shifted in the chair, the blanket slipping slightly, and Eli's coat still clung to her shoulders, its weight a strange comfort. She studied him as he stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the faint light of the lantern. There was a stillness to him, a quiet strength that made her wonder what battles he'd fought to earn it. "You don't have to stay up," she said, her voice soft but clear. He glanced back at her, one eyebrow raised. "Neither do you," he replied, and she almost smiled. The first flicker of lightness she'd felt in days. But the moment passed, and her thoughts returned to the man she'd fled. His name was Caleb, and his shadow loomed larger than the storm outside. She hadn't told Eli about him, not really, but the cowboy seemed to understand more than she'd said. He moved to the table, pouring himself a cup of coffee from a pot on the stove, and offered her another mug of tea. She took it, grateful for the warmth, and their fingers brushed for a moment, sending a jolt through her. It wasn't fear, but something else, yes, something she didn't dare name. "You're not from around here," Eli said, more a statement than a question. She shook her head. "I was passing through, got caught up in a broken bar things." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push, just nodded and sipped his coffee. The silence was filled with the soft patter of rain and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Clara's mind raced, piecing together the night's events, the choices that had led her here. She'd been a fool to trust Caleb, to believe his promises of a new life. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She'd run, and she'd keep running if she had to. Yet here, in this cabin, with Eli's steady presence, she felt a spark of something new, not just survival, but the possibility of something more. The thought scared her as much as it thrilled her. She glanced at Eli, who was watching the window again. His rifle lay within reach. "You think he's out there?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eli's jaw tightened. "If he is, he's a fool to come in this storm." His words were a promise, and Clara clung to them, letting them anchor her as the night wore on. Character count, 2996-7. The rain had stopped, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against cabin's walls. Clara's eyes burned with fatigue, but she fought to stay awake, her hands still wrapped around the now cold mug. Eli had moved to the door, checking the lock, his movements quiet but deliberate. The fire was nearly out, and the lantern's glow was the only light left, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. Clara's thoughts were a tangle of fear and hope, her mind replaying the moment she'd fled the saloon, Caleb's voice shouting after her, his threats swallowed by the crowd. She'd been invisible to them, just another woman in a torn dress. But to Caleb, she was a possession he wouldn't let go. The memory made her shiver, and she pulled Eli's coat tighter, its scent grounding her. Eli turned from the door, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, she saw something in his classic concern, maybe, or something deeper. "You should rest," he said, nodding toward the bed. She shook her head. "I can't, not yet." He didn't argue, just nodded and sat at the table, his rifle across his lap. The silence between them was heavy now, filled with unspoken questions. Clara wanted to tell him everything about Caleb, about the lies, about the bruises hidden under her torn dress, but the words felt too heavy, too dangerous. Instead, she asked, "Why do you live out here, all alone?" Eli leaned back, his eyes distant. "Wasn't always alone," he said, his voice rough. "Lost someone, a long time ago. Easier to keep the world at arm's length after that." His words hit her like a stone, and she saw the pain he carried, hidden beneath his quiet strength. She wanted to ask more, but the creak of the floorboards outside stopped her cold. Eli was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, his body tense. Clara's heart raced, her breath shallow as she stared at the door. The sound came again, a deliberate step, not the wind. Eli motioned for her to stay quiet, his eyes locked on the door. "Stay back," he whispered, moving to the window. Clara slid from the chair, crouching low, her pulse pounding in her ears. The lantern flickered, casting wild shadows, and she clutched the coat, her only shield. Eli peered through the window, his face hard, and then he relaxed slightly. "Just a branch," he said, but his grip on the rifle didn't loosen. Clara exhaled, her body trembling, but the fear didn't leave her. She knew Caleb was out there somewhere, and this moment of peace was fragile. Eli sat again, his eyes never leaving the door, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude for this stranger who'd become her protector. The night was far from over, but with Eli beside her, she felt a flicker of courage she hadn't known she had. Character count, 2993-8. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin's windows, pale and gray, softening the shadows but not the tension in the air. Clara hadn't slept, her body slumped in the chair, Eli's coat still draped over her like a lifeline. The silence outside was unnerving after the storm's roar, and every rustle of leaves made her flinch. Eli stood by the window, his rifle propped against the wall, his eyes scanning the clearing outside. He hadn't slept either, his face etched with fatigue but unwavering in its resolve. Clara watched him, marveling at the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him, a man who'd chosen solitude but hadn't hesitated to help her. Her thoughts were clearer now, the panic of the night giving way to a fragile determination. She couldn't stay here forever, hiding in this cabin, but the thought of leaving of facing the world alone terrified her. Caleb was still out there, his shadow looming over her future, but for the first time, she felt a spark of defiance. She wasn't the woman who'd run blindly into the storm anymore. Eli turned, catching her gaze, and offered a small nod, as if he could sense the shift in her. "Storms past," he said, his voice steady. "You'll need to decide what's next." She nodded, her throat tight. "I don't know where to go," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Eli crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair, his eyes level with hers. "You don't have to know yet," he said, "but you're stronger than you think." "I see it." His words were a balm, soothing the raw edges of her fear. She wanted to believe him, to believe she could carve out a life beyond Caleb's reach. The cabin felt smaller now, the world outside pressing in, but Eli's presence made it bearable. A distant sound of horses' whinny made them both tense, and Eli was at the window in an instant, his hand on the rifle. Clara's heart pounded, but she stood, the blanket falling to the floor. "If it's him," she said, her voice steady despite her fear, "I won't let him take me." Eli looked at her, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "He won't," he said, and she believed him. The whinny came again, closer now, and Eli opened the door, stepping into the dawn's light, rifle in hand. Clara followed, her bare feet cold on the threshold, but she stood tall, wrapped in his coat, ready to face whatever came next. The clearing was empty, the horses' sound fading into the distance, but the moment felt like a turning point. She wasn't running anymore, she was choosing her path, and Eli was by her side, a stranger who'd become her strength.